Can a ceasefire deal in Chad lead the way to peace talks and a presidential election? Or will rebel groups continue their assault to oust the country's ruling military council? I'm Jafar Hasnan, and today's newsmaker is the Chad Peace Agreement. Early last year, Chad's President Idriss Déby led his army several hundred kilometers north of the capital. They went head-on with the country's main rebel group, which calls itself the Front for Change and conquered in Chad. Well, change is exactly what happened. This was the scene of Déby's funeral. The president was shot on the battlefield and later died. After 3 decades, Chad had a new leader. Déby's 37-year-old son, Mohammed, a 4-star general, formed a transitional military council, and the violence continued. The junta killed dozens of protesters demanding civilian rule. Groups such as Boko Haram and a Daesh offshoot have killed civilians and displaced thousands. Clashes earlier this year killed around 100 people in the northern part of the country, and French petrol stations were attacked, highlighting a downturn in public opinion for one of the military council's biggest allies. And that brings us to what happened this week in Doha. 40 opposition groups signed a deal with the government to cease fighting and pave the way for reconciliation talks and a presidential election. It says the junta agrees not to take any military operations against the signing groups. The rebels agreed to disarm and stop recruiting. They will also get amnesty and safe passage home, and both sides agreed to release prisoners.
It is important in the result which we got at the end of this long process. And I think that this agreement will lead us to a sustainable peace in Chad. And this agreement allows to all these armed groups which signed this agreement to take part to the national inclusive dialogue.
But not everyone in the opposition signed on, and that included one major party at the center of this dispute.
Unfortunately, there are still around 10 parties that did not agree to sign this peace agreement, including the Front for Change and Concord in Chad, which was at the origin of the death of President Déby. I regret that.
Now, fact says negotiators did not listen to its demands, which included a guarantee that Mohammed Idriss Déby would not run in an upcoming election. The standoff puts any future talks in peril and leaves many wondering what can bring peace to the nation. Well, let's ask our panel. Joining me now from London is David Otto. He's the director for the Geneva Center for Africa Security and Strategic Studies. Andrew Yaw Tchie is in London. He's a senior research fellow at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs. And also in London is Paul Melly, an Africa Program Consulting Fellow at Chatham House. Thanks very much for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Paul, let me begin with you. What does the agreement really mean when the country's main rebel group has not even signed off on it?
Well, I don't think it should be completely dismissed. It's obviously better to have some groups that have at least reached some sort of starting point understanding, starting point agreement, if you like, than none at all. But we do need to really put it in context. You know, Chad was under Idriss Déby, the father, who was killed in April last year, for a long time, for pretty much 3 decades, an authoritarian state, despite some sort of constitutional democratic structures, but really an authoritarian strongman regime. And when he was killed, his son, Mohammed, has emerged as the head of the transitional junta that is leading the country and is supposed to prepare for this next constitutional stage. But the big question, will that transition lead to a more inclusive Chad, a Chad in which a wider base of groups, not just armed groups, but also political parties, civil society, the interests of all the different main segments of the population be taken into account? Or will the transition simply produce, as it were, a repackaged or a dressed up version of the old Deby regime, that is to say, authoritarian and strongly rooted in the support of his own ethnic, Idriss Déby's ethnic group, the Sahrawi from the east of the country? That's the big question. And that's why so many people remain skeptical, even though some of these armed groups have signed up. And your point about the decision of fact, the largest armed group, the one that Idriss Déby's troops were fighting at the time he was killed, not signing up to this peace accord, that's just part of the picture, but it signals the caution that everybody's got. If this is just a repackaged Deby regime with a few people, as it were, co-opted into it or persuaded to play roles, it won't take Chad all the way forward.
Okay. David, let me come to you now. To what extent does the absence of fact from this agreement create uncertainty over the successful implementation of the agreement that was signed in Doha?
I do, intend to agree with Paul that I mean the fact movement is one of the largest, if not the largest rebel group, and of course if it does side away from the peace deal. Of course, but they've made it very clear in their August 7th communique that they are still open to negotiations, subject, of course, to certain agreements. Of course, one being that some of the prisoners that were taken from, the rebel groups should be released, and that, the son does not present himself, and others do not present themselves as part of the beyond the interim government. But, of course, I think, of course, with all the terms and conditions, but I think it's going to be very crucial. Now, we had about 52 different armed groups. But mind you, this is all, you might get the numbers as quite a lot, but this is more or less a family affair. Most of these groups are led or influenced by one uncle or nephew or one form of relative that is linked to the Idriss Déby tribe and family. So it's a situation where we really need to take into context the traditional, cultural, and family ties dynamics. Now, I don't think that we would have some form of implementation being successful if the biggest group decides to pull out. But even if the rest of the groups, do want to move ahead, what you would see, as we've seen in the past, is that those with most men and most arms will always call sway. But it's a great step forward, as long as those terms and conditions are reasonable to the interim government. But as long as the family affairs issues are resolved internally. So it's a more complex, scenario than meets the eye.
Okay, Andrew. Now, David says it's a great step forward. So tell me, is this going to pave the way for lasting peace in the country?
I think it's good to be optimistic, but it's also important to be realistic about what the agreement is in principle. There are several steps that need to be taken. This is one of the steps. There still needs to be some form of an agreement, particularly when it comes to the constitution making process, what that will mean, what it will involve, and that hasn't been decided yet. So at the moment, as it stands, yes, it's a good step, but I don't think it's something that you can say yes conclusively. We will deliver a democratic Chad overnight. It will take time, and what I mean by this is that all transitional agreements, even if you look at Sudan or other neighboring countries and their transitional agreements, they go through processes. And the key thing here is that the stipulations of the protocols within the agreement must be upheld to. And so while there is a signing of an agreement, which is good in principle, and there is goodwill from both civil society organizations and momentum, that momentum is also dragging out. The process has prolonged to a degree, but also you still have to have elections, you still have to have the transitional period come to an end, constitutional process formed, there has to be an agreement about who governs when, the proportionality of that, how do you deal with things like the national army. All of these aspects are still aspects that need to be ironed out, and that hasn't been done. So what the agreement we have initially is, okay, how do we bring those parties to agree to? Again, as the other commentators have said, 43 groups have signed up to it. There are almost 53 groups. So the largest groups are not part of this agreement, and so what really needs to happen is that momentum needs to be continued. But again, that dialogue with those groups who didn't sign needs to take place alongside this actual agreement as well. But what is also key above this is also making sure that the agreement and those who are holding the key actors accountable check in each time. And what I mean by this is making sure that the deadlines, making sure that every protocol is met on time, or if it is delayed, that you come to some form of agreement. Again, if you look at South Sudan and other countries, Mali, you see the same problems here where an agreement is signed, but it takes, instead of taking 10 months to deliver, it takes 3 or 4 years. And that causes frustration. So again, if you have those groups that haven't signed, who see this sort of pattern and trend going on, then that means that other groups become fragmented and potentially could join. So it's still early days. It's a good good step, but again, we still need to see how
it's a good step, but it's not conclusive. Let me put it to Paul. Paul, now Andrew says that this is a good step, but it's not conclusive. A, do you agree with him? B, what would be, if you agree with him, what would be a conclusive agreement?
Well, I certainly do agree with him. Of course, it's better to have some agreement with some people than none at all. But what would be a conclusive agreement is more even than just a peace accord between the government and the armed groups, because Chadian politics, or Chadian politics and conflict for 30 years has been largely dominated by the fact that a number of segments of the population, a number of communities, particularly in the north and in the east, have been engaged in armed activity, including and particularly Déby himself, so that the military under Idriss Déby, the father, was very much rooted in the strength of his own Sahrawi community. But there are many other people in Chad, and there are large segments of the population who feel left out. And you can see, for example, in the current politics around the whole transition, only some political parties have bought into the transition process or been willing to join the transitional government that the junta is overseeing, if you like. Others, some of the most important, have preferred to stay out of it because they simply don't trust the transition process. They don't think that it's really genuinely comprehensive. So we come back to this core thing that even if you get an agreement between the armed groups, that is only part of the way towards getting a political settlement that actually gives voice to the full range of populations and main communities in Chad. And that second stage will be really difficult because sometimes there are conflicts of interest. For example, there are big livestock owners closely linked to the Déby regime, whose animals they've been expanding their herds and ranging into the farmlands of southern farming communities, and that's caused a lot of resentment. And there's a perception that these livestock tycoons, if you like, that their interests are protected by the military. The Chadian military isn't representing the whole population, it's only looking after certain groups or certain sectional interests. And so that's building up resentment in the south. And there are probably other community issues in other parts of the country that remain to be resolved.
And
there
Paul,
was a
if I may
local
interject, even this agreement that was reached in Doha does not address the factions within the society which have been largely ignored by the military over the past few decades?
Yeah, it doesn't, but that's probably because they were peace talks between the government and armed groups, and these southern communities on the whole, their voice is more expressed through politics these days. I mean, there have in the past been some armed activity in the south, but that's a long time ago. So it's first you need a peace accord so that there isn't violence, and that in itself presents a big challenge because as uh, as David and Andrew have pointed out, FACT is a big armed group and it's not in the agreement, and there are other armed groups also not in it.
Okay.
But then even beyond beyond what you might call the military peace agreement, you then need to get a political process which gets the real buy-in of all the main political parties and a sort of full range of Chadian communities, and that we're a long way from that as well.
Right. Now, I think you make some very good points here, David. I would like to come to you now. You know, as they say, when there's a political will, there's always a way out. There's always a way to end violence in a country. Now, I'm sure you have read the agreement. Some of the highlights of the agreements are that the junta has agreed not to take any military operation against the groups who signed this agreement. Plus, the rebels agreed to disarm and stop recruiting. Tell me, do you think there is enough political will among the stakeholders to finally bring the violence to an end?
I think the biggest problem is that we are not even yet talking about the political will, because the so-called military junta is not considered to be a legitimate government. I mean, it's very simple. Mahatma Idris, took over unconstitutionally, and that has been clearly a constitutional coup. And therefore, the rebel groups, do not see him or his allies as part of any political movement. He's merely one of the factions, and of course one of the parties to a conflict, of interest, and that conflict of interest, wants to establish a political system. But while we're still on establishing that political system, what I see here is that there is some kind of a rebel will, rebel willingness to come to the table. But of course, this is again highlighting the point which I made earlier on, that what is happening in Chad is a family affair. These groups feel that they are entitled to some sort of positions within the government, and it's made worse, by the fact that the son of Idris Deby, has taken over power from his father. So we're still to come to the point whereby we can somehow measure the political will. I mean, the only political will that we can really measure here is the political will of Qatar to hold these talks. First as a facilitator, and then as a mediator. But
Right.
Still early days, and we hope for the best.
All right. Andrew, let me come to you. I want to pick up on one point made by David there. He says that the military junta is not seen as a legitimate source of power in the country. In fact, this is something that critics have been saying about Chad for decades. They don't see the current president, who is the son of the slain president, a legitimate as someone who should be in office right now. So tell me, what keeps emboldening him? Are there international players in place here, or does he get his source of power from within the country?
I think there are two things going on here. I think the first thing is I would say more nationally. This is aligned to the civil society's groups. They see this as a good step, as in trying to negotiate, trying to resolve the conflict. And so there's a split momentum. I think it's something around 55-45, where those are optimistic about the steps that are being taken, but also optimistic about the role that the junta is trying to do to move things forward. So there is that aspect. And then there's the family ties, as David has mentioned, that really tie different ethnic groups together, particularly the sort of the military junta's ethnic lineage, and how that has kept should I say, people in check. But I think what is important from that aspect is that people are also not happy with the way he's been doing things as well. And this is something that many have said that actually, give it time, some of the generals might or could potentially throw him out. So that's, I think, the second aspect. And then the third aspect, internationally, if you were to open it up, is a key thing for the stuff that we work on at NUPI, is that one of the things that we realize is, particularly because the Chadian forces are seen as quite key for UN missions in MINUSMA, for the Multinational Joint Task Force in the Lake Chad Basin, the G5 Sahel, but also quite rapidly deployed troops that are available to deal with insecurity across borders. And so that is the other aspect that I think is also, from an international perspective, has weighed on the junta's side. And so what you see is a sort of a heavy-handed approach to Mali and other countries, but actually with Chad, you see more of a laid-back position on this, and particularly because of this third aspect, I think this is what has kept the transitional sort of military council in charge, but also in power to date. But I think if the agreement falls apart and if civil society don't see things moving forward, particularly, like I said, key milestones like elections and the constitutional process, then I think that sort of favoritism that they have in him will wane, particularly nationally, and that's crucial because while you might have international support, particularly France and others, nationally that drives things, and so if the national support isn't there, then he's in trouble as well.
Okay. Paul, let me come to you. Now, France is certainly a key stakeholder here. What good has France brought to the country?
Well, if you look back to the funeral event of Idriss Déby in April last year, and of course everybody was in shock. This was a sudden event, and President Macron flew in for the funeral and tried to give two messages. So his official public message was to say that France would stand with the people of Chad and stand up for Chad's security. And that was seen, if you like, as an endorsement of the new transitional junta that was set up by Idriss Déby's son, Mahamat. And it was, the French argument was that at that very moment, the fact rebels were not that far from the capital, N'Djamena, and so the very basic security and stability of the country was in play. But the other thing that Macron tried to do was to put French political support behind the efforts of two other members of the G5 Sahel, Niger and Mauritania. And the presidents of those two countries also attended the funeral, and they, supported by France, tried to basically convince the new junta that what Chad needed to do was go down the road towards this more inclusive and participatory politics. In a sense, France and its West African allies, of whom Niger and Mauritania are two of the most trusted, if you like, they saw whereas with Idriss Déby father, the French basically felt, well, they couldn't change Chadian internal politics, so they would just maintain a good relationship with Idriss Déby because Chad is such an important security actor, as Andrew was pointing out, in the region, and there are French troops based in N'Djamena. But when Father Déby, Idriss, was killed, the French, just like the West Africans, spotted the moment to try and encourage Chad down the path of a more participatory politics, because in the very long, there was a question, Mahamat Déby doesn't have this, to be a strong man, people have to believe that you are a tough guy. Everybody thought that about Idriss Déby. Nobody really knew what to make of Mahamat. But the problem now facing the French is that so far progress towards this hoped for consensual, more participatory, more genuinely democratic political process has been either slow or non-existent, depending, but it certainly hasn't been rapid. The transition has been really dragged out. We're still a long way from resolving those basic political problems. We still don't know whether really Ahmed Déby is prepared to share power. And that leaves France in a very awkward spot, because it doesn't want to be associated with a dictator, but equally, it doesn't feel it can just sort of break with Chad either.
Paul, this is going to be my last question of the show. So are you indicating that it's about time for France to pull out from Chad?
I don't think it's for me to say they should. I think what we are seeing, though, is a bit of a shift of emphasis, so that the French have transferred the headquarters of their main Sahel support for the Sahelian countries has been transferred to Niger, which is for Paris is a much easier partner because the Niger government is basically democratic. You know, you can see certain flaws in the system, but it's basically a genuinely multi-party political system where power has changed hands through the ballot box sometimes. And that's an easier partner for France, but I don't think they will abandon Chad. The country is just too important in strategic terms for the whole of the Sahel and Central Africa.
All right, unfortunately, we're out of time. Paul, Andrew, and David, thanks very much for talking to us here on The Newsmakers. And thank you for watching. You can follow The Newsmakers on Twitter and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Jafar Hasnan. See you next time.